Thank you for joining the McCain Institute's Authors and Insights Book Talk series, a series of discussions with authors of important, newly released books on American politics, policy, and leadership. My husband, John McCain, fought his whole life to promote American character-driven leadership and democracy to the public, and it's incredibly important today to carry that legacy forward by any means possible. Today's installment, The Roles of Freedom and Democracy in American Foreign Policy, will feature General H.R. McMaster, who served in the military for 34 years and held the position of the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, as well as being a close friend of my husband for many years. He will be talking about his new book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, with Dr. Michael Crow, the 16th president of Arizona State University, McCain Institute trustee, and a dear friend to my family. We're honored to host a pair of thought leaders in General McMaster and President Crow for what will be an important and timely discussion on U.S. foreign policy.
Dr. Crow, go ahead. You can begin.
All right, great. Glad to see everybody here. General McMaster, nice to see you again. What I want to do first is say the book, fantastic piece of work. Got many little tags on it. I want to spend some time relative to a set of core ideas that you put out in the book. In fact, some that I think that are fantastic in the sense that they're really concepts that we should be using in the articulation of our thinking about foreign policy and national defense policy and so forth. And I've articulated 20 questions for you. 17 I'd like to have quick answers to, that is not elongated answers. And then the last 3 I really want to spend a bunch of time on. So the first one is, and you articulate this, we've seen unbelievable change since 1945. If you look at the results of the 2 great wars of the 20th century, we have the most peaceful Europe that we've ever seen. We've seen the greatest advance of democracy in the history of our species. And we've seen economic progress like no one could ever have possibly imagined. We have the realignment of Germany and Japan into successful economic democracies. So the question then to you is, goes all the way back to the Wilsonian promise, this notion of protect, defend, and advance democracy. In general, how do you think things are going in general? In the last 120 years, in general, how do you think we're doing?
Right. Well, President Crow, what a pleasure it is to be with you and to be here at an institute that is named for a man for whom I have tremendous respect, Senator McCain, and what a privilege it was to know him over the years. And I admire him and his record of service, and I admire you and your record of service and what you've done at Arizona State. What a wonderful institution. So thanks for the opportunity to be with you. I think, Michael, we ought to be pretty happy about it, right? The way you laid it out. If you look at this last 100 years in the context of the broad sweep of history, I think we have made tremendous progress, especially after the 2 most destructive wars in modern history, World War I and World War II, to have crafted an enduring peace, at least a peace without great power conflict, and a peace, as you alluded to, has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But I think we can't be complacent.
Yeah, complacency never works, right? Cole, are you getting the general's disruption here? Martin. So I lost you there for a second. So
Okay.
Let me go to the so we sort of view things that no complacency, lots of progress, tremendous struggle. In fact, it's the struggle for this, in some ways, the soul and the core of humanity. Will we be individually free humans, will we be able to advance our own lives based on the core principles of our democracy as a species or not? And and we have made tremendous progress. And so one of the words that you use in Battlegrounds is an important word to me as an old pugilist and heavyweight wrestler and all the other things I was involved in. What's the core of the fight? It's more than martial, and you talk about that. What do you think is the core of the fight?
I think the core of the fight is that we have to compete effectively to ensure that our free and open societies remain secure, are prosperous, and it can extend our influence effectively. And I think we have to recognize that we have to compete and re-enter arenas of competition, Michael, that we vacated, I think, because of over-optimism in the 1990s and maybe too much pessimism and even resignation in the 2000s. And we're I think, at a fundamental level in a competition between our free and open societies and closed authoritarian systems.
So the competition is much more than martial. It's philosophical. It's I don't want to say cultural. That would be the wrong word. But it's about core principles of who we are as humans, and there are martial elements to it where you have to defend yourself from being overrun by others or wounded by others. So that's the nature of the fight. It's everything, basically.
It's everything, and I make an argument in the book for strategic competence, and that competence is really our ability to integrate all of our elements of national power with efforts of like-minded partners. And so we don't want to militarize policy, but we don't want to use only diplomacy or only law enforcement or only information and communications. It's really our ability to integrate those efforts and increasingly integrate efforts across the public and private sector and take the approach to these problems that you take at Arizona State, which is an interdisciplinary approach to these challenges and these opportunities.
Bring in your whole where you've really made some significant contributions to the design of our national defense policy and national foreign policy. So let me sort of pin down some things. We're still in the short answer form. So in this notion of when does something not become any longer a strategic threat? So I'm going to use Russia, which you talk a lot about, and which has been a strategic threat to the United States and may still be a strategic threat going forward to the United States. But I've been to Russia many times. I've been all over the place. I remember my first visit there in 1991. I got off the plane and I said, "You're kidding me, right? These guys don't even know how to gas up an airplane." And so it doesn't mean that they're not a military threat, and it doesn't mean that they're not a strategic threat, but their economy has been declining. They can't float a navy. They have a dictator who roams the planet doing whatever he wants with this sort of new approach that I'm going to bring in here in a second. Mexico's economy is now almost as large as Russia's economy. They're a fading G20 and Mexico is a rising G20. So the question then is, in short form, when is a threat no longer strategic? At what point is it no longer strategic?
Well, it's strategic if you have a massive nuclear arsenal and if you're unscrupulous. And Michael, this is what Russia wants to do, is they don't want to compete with us on our own terms. They want to drag everybody else down. Putin, I think, recognizes the constraints that he's under economically, demographically, especially now in the wake of COVID, the collapse of oil prices. But what did he do recently? I mean, they poisoned his main political opponent, Navalny. And he's engaged in a sustained campaign of political subversion against us. What Russia really wants to do is to sow doubts about who we are as a people, to polarize our society, to pit us against each other, and reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. Russia isn't strong enough to create vulnerabilities in our society, but they are strong enough to exploit them. And that's what we see Russia doing. Putin's theory of victory is to be the last man standing and to be successful in this campaign of subversion against the free world.
Yeah, which is the classic position of a dictator, the classic position of a singularly focused individual who has no interest beyond themselves.
And is driven by, I think, these emotions, right? The sense of honor lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this ambition to restore Russia to national greatness. Mm-hmm. So he's using the tools he has available, which, as you mentioned, are limited, but they're also very dangerous.
Well, they're dangerous, particularly as they decline. So it's perhaps the nature of a different kind of classification for a strategic relationship. Next quick question. So So, before World War II, the U.S. Army was a small institution. The military of the United States was generally only expanded for the time of war. We never found ourselves in a position of maintaining a war footing or war capabilities for decade after decade after decade. So this is the first time in our republic's history that we have really done this. And so what do you think are the costs or the risks of maintaining? I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying it's the way it is. What are the costs or the risks of a permanent war footing?
Well, it should be a permanent deterrence footing, we hope, right? Because what you want to build an armed force that can convince your adversaries that they could not accomplish their objectives through the use of force against you. And I think what we realized in the 20th century is if there ever was an age of free security when North America could rely on the two great moats of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, technology had eliminated that age of free security. And we are in an increasingly interconnected and shrinking world in which challenges to our security overseas can quite readily reach our shores. And that's whether it's jihadist terrorists, as they did on September 11th, 2001, or a new coronavirus, that reached our shores earlier this year. So I think what the argument in Battlegrounds, Michael, is essentially we have to stay engaged, and we have to have a broad range of defensive capabilities, not just military, to convince our adversaries that they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force or the use of other means below the threshold of what might elicit a military response.
Right. So that segues to my next quick question, which is, how do you design a comprehensive defense strategy, exactly as you suggested in the book? Military, cyber, bio, climate, political interference, all these things. The military is not well equipped to deal with all of those things. In fact, it's not equipped to deal with some of them at all. If you look at our response to the pandemic, we look like a pack of fools in a lot of ways, because we can't get our act together. We can't make command and control decisions in the way that we should. A lot of things are going on at all levels, not just at the national level. And so the question is a simple one. How do you design a comprehensive defense strategy? And how do you design a comprehensive defense strategy that's got to be more than the military?
Well, you start with design thinking. I think we have to start with framing these complex challenges, understanding them on their own terms, and then viewing them through the lens of our vital interests, answering the question, why do we care? And then we can craft overarching goals and more specific objectives, and then inventory the tremendous tools and competitive advantages we have at our disposal. That's the beginning, I think, of being able to develop a policy and a strategy. Also important is understanding really what are the assumptions under which we have to operate. Assumptions, as you're mentioning, what are the limits of our competency in the system that we have, but also what are our competitive advantages. And very importantly, it's very important to acknowledge the degree to which others have agency and authorship over the future, and recognize the interactive nature of these competitions. So I think we skip a lot of these steps in Washington, Michael. We tend to rush to actions that we're comfortable with already, or we tend to try to fit everything into a military stovepipe or a cylinder of excellence, and instead of recognizing that real competence comes with integrating our efforts.
So the design approach is exactly it, and it probably does mean, and you articulate this. You also talk about, identifying and respecting to some extent the agency even of our adversaries or our competitors, and as well as enhancing the agency of different groups within the United States itself, which means rethinking the entire process, as you suggest later in the book, and I'll come to this a little bit later, to be non-linear. We're so linear right now in our thinking that we just follow these historic paths, and none of that, as COVID has shown us, none of that really works. Our linear thinking, we knew COVID was coming. We knew there were going to be great pandemics. We thought in linear ways, and we weren't ready.
Right. And the models were wrong, and we misunderstood big aspects of the problem. We had to learn continuously and adapt. We weren't as agile as we needed to be. I think the words that I would use, Michael, that we have to really emphasize is the ability to coordinate and integrate efforts. We're a federal system, right? We're a republic, and we're not going to have strong centralized control. And actually, that we'd be terrible at it if we tried to do it. We have to coordinate and integrate more effectively, and with the private sector as well.
So in short form, leaving enough time for the three big questions at the end. So World War I and World War II changed Europe and its future forever. The Enlightenment was saved. The last 400 years of social and cultural progress was saved. Those two wars ensured the stabilization of Europe. Yet it looks like people are no longer interested in the maintenance of this alliance, in the maintenance of this Western alliance. And so, good or bad? I know the answer, but how bad is the non-maintenance of this Western alliance?
It's bad, but the situation and the prospects are not as bad as we think, because I think there's a growing realization, Michael, that we in the free world are all in this together. I mean, when you look at really the aggression of the Chinese Communist Party, this wolf warrior diplomacy, and there's nothing like the prospect of death, right, to focus the mind. And I think that in the West, within Europe and between Europe and the United States, the transatlantic relationship, including now the United Kingdom, the separate out from the European Union, but still, culturally and in terms of principles and values connected to the continent, that I think we recognize now that we are in a competition. That's the first step. And we have to cooperate together to build a better future for generations to come. And I think there's a growing realization as we're in this crisis of COVID, the recession associated with it, and a crisis of confidence as well, Michael.
So one of the things that you introduce in the book very well, I think, and very clearly is this RNGW, Russian Next Generation Warfare. So they hold Crimea right now because of their successful implementation of those methods of comprehensive conflict, lawfare, social disruption, political disruption, cultural disruption, social media messaging, interruption of democratic processes. They've even done a number of those here in our country and other countries around the world. So the question then on RNGW is, if that's what the enemy is using, why are we not countering it with the same kind of approach or undermining that approach? And again, short answer.
Well, we're starting to. I think we're getting more adept at this. And when I say we, it's the U.S. government, but the U.S. government along with allies and partners. There is a lot of great coordination going on with like-minded countries that doesn't really meet the eye. We need to become even better at it. I think if you look at the contrast between Russia's attack on the 2016 election and their lack of effectiveness in 2018, you can see some of the effects that our defensive measures have had, and then also some changes in policy that have unleashed our cyber capabilities. I think what's also important, though, is that you use actually your competitive advantages. What you've seen in particular with our ability to conduct law enforcement investigations that are important not only for the indictments and the sanctions on these groups like the Internet Research Agency and
what I call lawfare. Yeah, instead of warfare, it's lawfare. So yeah.
It's lawfare, right? But what we've been able to do is pull the curtain back better now and expose the Kremlin's activity, expose it to sunlight, and sunlight is the best disinfectant in this case, I think. When you're looking at this form of Russian new generation warfare, this aspect of it, which I call, and many call now, cyber-enabled information warfare against us, which is part of this overall campaign of political subversion.
So one of the things as I was reading the book that I kept coming back to in my mind was this notion of you're writing this book with the U.S. Still remaining as the sole superpower on the planet, and then I remember the last big sole superpower on the planet was Rome, which then had internalization of conflict, unbelievable social and political disruption, weaknesses, collapse, ultimately people being killed on the floor of the Senate, the tribunes and others and the proconsuls and the councils all at each other's throats, and then ultimately the demise of the entire empire. Any worries about our empire?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't call it an empire, but I do have a concern about the free world overall. But I think that if what you're seeing these days is heartening in connection with a much higher degree of international cooperation. If you just look at the reaction to recent aggression by the Chinese Communist Party and how that has brought together India, Australia, Japan, and the United States across Indo-Pacific to figure out how to work together with even more partners on that particular problem set. And then I think the relationship with the EU, with EU countries, with the UK is getting stronger as well. And if our free and open societies work together, especially I think from an economic perspective, Japan, the EU, and the US cooperating together, it's really going to be tough to beat. And I think that's the best shot at convincing our adversaries that they can accomplish enough of what they want without trying to do it at our expense and the expense of future generations.
Yeah, I'm gonna skip around here a little bit. So it was interesting that you use Sun Tzu's great quote. If you know your enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will suffer a defeat. And so I'm sitting there and I'm saying to myself, so we do know Russia, and they were defeated and by us. Did we know Vietnam?
No, we didn't know Vietnam. And Michael, this was the topic of a previous book I wrote called
I read that book also. Yes.
Revolution. And really,
then to a quick answer, do we know China?
I think we're learning more about China, right? I think that we had this narcissistic view of China. We defined China in relation to us and how we would like China to be. And we had, kind of a hubristic attitude. We can change China. We can, if we welcome China into the international community, they'll play by the rules, they'll liberalize, and they'll change their form of government, But of course, that wasn't the case because we underestimated the degree to which ideology and emotion drives and constrains the Chinese Communist Party in particular. Of course, as you know, Michael, we all know China's anything but monolithic or homogeneous.
Right.
So it's important, I think, for us to distinguish between the Chinese people broadly and the Chinese Communist Party, which is a small percentage of the Chinese people, and they're the ones in charge.
I've been probably in the 15 largest cities of China and several of them many times, and we have lots of activities there. There's hundreds of thousands of organizations, American organizations, companies, universities, and others working in China, doing things in China, working with the people, not working so much with the government, but working with the people and with the economy in lots of ways. Do we know Iran?
No, I don't think so. What I read about in the book is our policy toward Iran has missed two big aspects of understanding the behavior of the Iranian regime. First of all, the ideology of the regime and the ideology of the revolution, and really who's in charge are the revolutionaries. They won, right? There were, you could say, Republicans and revolutionaries, and the revolutionaries won out, right? This is Ayatollah Khamenei and the Guardian Council. And
you had the quote of the two Ayatollahs and sort of how they viewed the world. I thought that was interesting, the way you brought in the multiple Ayatollahs. So.
Right. And so this is an element of this. This is a theocratic dictatorship. The second fact we miss sometimes is Iran has been fighting a proxy war against us for 4 decades. And so we tend to focus on a discrete issue. What is Iran doing in Iraq? What is Iran doing in Syria? How about Lebanon? Well, what about the nuclear program? When I think it's very important to understand these challenges holistically and put together a policy and a strategy that understands the full range of this particular challenge.
Certainly, if we're going to take Sun Tzu's advice, I also found it interesting that you're very much like him, a general, a writer, a philosopher, a thinker. So, you brought a lot to bear also. My son, Ryan, was in Afghanistan 6 or 7 times on nation building projects, working on projects with the U.S. Agency for International Development while the combat operations were still going on around the country. And I remember him telling me, how difficult it was to have the military and the civilians all working together in the actual art of nation building. And he told me story after story of complexities. We had a little GPS locator that I gave him, so I'd always know where to go get him. Because he wasn't in a military unit, he was a civilian actually out in the field. And so what about nation building? So, we go in and we eliminate the Taliban threat through combat arms. We become engaged, in a more successful way than all of the British attempts, fighting in some sense the same groups over time. Yet we have not built a nation yet. And so, what's your thing about that part of what we do when we undertake such projects?
Well, obviously, it has to be the people of that nation who build a nation. And I think oftentimes we go in and we try to do too much ourselves. In the case of Afghanistan, we neglected this very important task of consolidating military gains to get to a sustainable outcome there. And then after that neglect, we realized it, then we dumped too much money, too much resources into the country beyond the absorptive capacity of the country. And we did it in a way that was not really sensitive to the traditions, the history, and the culture of Afghanistan.
But all those things that you just mentioned are knowable. So the military is there to protect, defend, and defeat the enemy. I mean, that protect our assets, protect our interests, defend our interests, and defeat the enemy. That's the purpose of the military. While at the same time, out of the other corner of the mouth, working with others to try to build the country. Same kind of things went on in Vietnam also at the same time, as you know, and as you wrote about. Yet neither were successful by the means, or at least anywhere near the level of investment. Certainly, they didn't produce the kinds of results. And so, is there some other way to do this?
Yes, I mean, the way to do it is actually, let's learn from historical experience and make sure next time we don't go in under the illusion that the war can be fast, cheap, and efficient, and you can take what you might call the George Costanza approach to war and just leave on a high note. Right?
Yes.
The consolidation of gains has always been an integral part of war, except unless you're conducting a raid, right? A raid is a mission of short duration, limited purpose, and planned withdrawal, right? Otherwise, you have to consolidate gains. Now, that doesn't mean turning Afghanistan into Denmark.
And Noriega was a raid, not a war. We were trying to capture a particular person. So one last quick question. I've dropped some of the other ones off, although I thought your quote of Keith Alexander, General Alexander, was, the greatest transfer of wealth in history. And I'm like, well, not really, but the latest, but just for food for thought. Okay, it's great for General Alexander to say that, but like, how do you defend against that? And so it's like we don't even have the right rules, but we'll set that aside. So I noticed that you kept the Middle East as strategically important. And so why is it strategically important going forward? We've moved the American energy economy away from that region, reliance on that region. Increasingly, that will be the case. The Saudis and others are investing in whole new future economies. So all kinds of things that are going on. You've talked about a lot of that. Just in quick form, why do you think they're still strategically important?
Well, problems that originate in the Middle East don't stay in the Middle East, right? And this involves, first and foremost, jihadist terrorist organizations who thrive in an environment there that is described as one of a sectarian civil war broadly across the region. And what that war does, Michael, and as you as an educator understand something better than probably most people, is that there's a cycle of ignorance, hatred, and violence. And that sectarian conflict is perpetuating ignorance. How many children go to school there, right? And then that ignorance.
85 million people in that part of the world want to go to college and can't.
Right. And then it's easy among that population who's devoid of hope to foment hatred of the other, and use that hatred to justify violence against innocents. And that violent environment perpetuates ignorance. So that cycle has to be broken.
So it's a destabilization threat then. So they have the ability to destabilize all kinds of things, and that's the threat. And
to attack really all civilized peoples. And we have to remember, the greatest victims of jihadist terrorists are fellow Muslims. But as we know, these jihadist organizations are determined to commit mass murder on our territory and in Europe and elsewhere as their principal tactic in a war against all civilized peoples. And I write in the book, that I think these organizations are more dangerous today than they were on September 10th, 2001. This has a lot to do with them just being orders of magnitude larger in terms of people. It was the Mujahideen era, alumni of the resistance to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. It was them who committed the mass murder attacks of 9/11. The Al Qaeda, the ISIS, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, these various groups, the alumni of these organizations are orders of magnitude larger. They're more mobile. They have greater technological capability, and they have access to they're trying to get access to the most destructive weapons on earth. So it's an argument to be vigilant, to work with partners in the region to ensure that these groups don't gain the strength such that they can threaten us again on the scale of 9/11.
So and we don't have much time left before questions, but you bring in Antoine Bousquet, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Scientific Way of Warfare. So you say, what is required is a holistic approach that does not seek to isolate open systems, but apprehends their environment in profound increments. Now that is a profound thing to understand. The notion of open systems. the notion of understanding these open systems. You can't isolate these things and then cut it off and then hope that somehow that will solve it. And so how do we design a national defense system, including a military and other things? It has to be more than the military by the implication of the notion of an open system itself. There's economic, cultural, religious, social, military, all kinds of things. Where would you start to make something like that happen?
I think you have to start at the national level and pull together interdisciplinary teams to understand these problems holistically. But these have to be people. These are people who can understand the complex causality of events and phenomena, but also understand the tools that can be brought to bear. These have to be people who are intellectual to a certain extent, but also practitioners as well. And then understand better how to operate together and how to apply these capabilities synergistically. I'm talking about diplomatic efforts, cyber and information efforts, law enforcement, financial actions, economic actions, and it can be done. It can be done if these teams of civil servants, but also drawing on academia and the private sector, come together around these problem sets.
That doesn't seem to be easily implemented yet. I know the military is trying to do this in a number of new centers, a number of new initiatives, things related to new kinds of warfare, new kinds of conceptualization, Army Future Command, other things that are ongoing. You were a part of helping to conceptualize a lot of these things. How do you allow the military to keep its esprit de corps and its discipline and its culture, and yet at the same time open that culture and that esprit de corps and engagement to others?
I think a way to do it is education. I received this tremendous gift in the middle of my career. Right after Operation Desert Storm, I got to go to graduate school at the University of North Carolina, obtain a degree in history, to teach history. And I think this is the adult education model, Michael, in the military. We have it already, where you have formative, challenging experiences as a young person, and then you get to an educational experience. It allows you to reflect on your experiences and prepare for future responsibilities. And to learn about life, about, in this case for me, military history, and which I found quite relevant to my career.
Well, it may be that flag officers and senior field grade officers in the American military are among the most educated, most acutely both trained and educated individuals in our entire society. And then outside of the military, though, the awareness of the military and military culture and so forth and so on goes down really quickly. And there's a disconnect, I think, that we need to figure out how to solve that. How would you solve that?
I think we have to allow people to move more fluidly and easily between the private sector, the military, the public sector, and academia. We have to come up with personnel policies that make that super easy to do. So if somebody wants to contribute, who has a certain expertise and wants to contribute to our military or to a government agency of some kind, we ought to be able to welcome them in at a mid-career level and allow them to move back and forth. This is why I think the reserve model is very good.
There were lots of people that were made lieutenant commanders in the Navy because of their expertise in civilian life, and they were brought in as a part of the teams, and they made stuff happen across all dimensionalities of World War II, but we don't do that anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, the guy who was the CEO of General Motors really ran the industrial mobilization effort in World War II, for example. Right. So I think we have to do it, because really what we're seeing now is these threats. You mentioned Russian new generation warfare, but I describe others of these pernicious threats. They operate not just against our military, not just against our government. They operate against our private sector, and you see it in academia as well. So I think that we all have to be better educated. That's why I wrote the book, is I hope it will help people understand better the challenges that we face. And
I think it does a great job doing that. And the last question then, before we turn it back over to Cole, you got your McMaster 4 resolutions in here. 1, the NSC must deliver optionality for national security challenges. 2, you've got to understand more the nature of the problems themselves. 3, you need all government involved, not just the military. And 4, no linearity. Assume quantum forces. That was my word. Quantum forces, things that are happening. It's a difficult logic. So these 4 resolutions, to me, being trained the way that I'm trained and the way that I work, they make like perfect sense. And so then I apply this to COVID, and I'm like, we didn't do any of them, not one of them, relative to COVID. And I had to conclude, and I'm asking you this question, in all sincerity, I have to assume that somebody decided that global pandemics are not a national security threat, when of course they are.
Yeah, this is hey, this is the difference between planning and implementation and execution, right? I mean, a plan, you have a beautiful plan, but if you can't implement it, it's not going to be effective. And
Well, you know the 7 Ps. Did you ever learn that in the Army growing up?
yeah, sure, right.
Proper prior planning prevents piss poor performance. Yeah.
Right. But we understood, I think, what it would take. That we, being the U.S. government across multiple administrations, starting with George W. Bush, who had tremendous foresight on this, by the way. He read this is the power of history. He read a historical account of the 1918-1919 pandemic, and this is after 9/11. He convened his national security team and said, "Hey, I think we have a big potential problem here. We need to really get after this." And then
I saw the speech that he gave, that he outlined all the things that we should do. In fact, that's floating around these days because we didn't do any of those things.
Well, we did, and then we forgot. And then also what we did is we compromised efficiency for effectiveness. I mean, one of the biggest problems, Michael, was how we prioritized efficiency in supply chains over what would be necessary to respond to this. This is the problem with PPE and some of the pharmaceuticals, right? We had supply chains that were fragile, that were over-reliant on China, and we didn't stockpile what we needed, because over time, and we'll probably do this again. I hope we don't. After this pandemic, we'll hopefully not forget the lessons of it.
I think the picture's good, and so I think the picture's fantastic. I think the book is a straightforward, honest assessment of where we are, and I think your prescriptions, this notion of the scientific way of warfare, breaking the cycle, the resolutions for the National Security Council, these are very significant contributions. One last final question: what is strategic empathy?
Strategic empathy is the ability to view these complex challenges and opportunities from the perspective of the other. And it's the best.
Adversary.
Including especially adversaries, rivals, and enemies. It is the antidote to what I describe as strategic narcissism, which is the tendency to assume what we do is, or decide not to do, is going to be decisive to the outcome, and to engage in wishful thinking that turns into self-delusion. So strategic empathy, I borrowed it from a great historian named Zachary Shore. I recommend his work. He's written a book called A Sense of the Enemy, in which he introduced this phrase of strategic empathy. And I think it's immensely important because, as you mentioned already, none of these challenges are conducive toward a linear progress. There is a continuous interaction with many other actors, including adversaries, rivals, and enemies, and very complex environments. And so you need an overarching policy and strategy, but that strategy has to be flexible in implementation and in execution.
I remember, and I did read your book about Vietnam. So I was trapped in Maine a few summers ago and ended up reading a book that just happened to be on the bookshelf of this house that my wife's family owns. And it was an Army history book that they must have bought at some yard sale or something, that was written by an Army historian during the Vietnam War. And it was nothing but Ho Chi Minh's life. And I remember this Army historian at the end of the book said, well, Ho Chi Minh is the rough equivalent of George Washington. In the sense of the revolutionary general, lots of differences and so forth and so on. And at the end of the book, he said, we don't understand these people. We don't understand who this person is. We don't understand anything about what we're involved in. And it was just kind of, you could just see it as like Army Report 99-66. And I just happened to read it. And I remember being profoundly affected by the notion of our lack of understanding, this lack of strategic empathy. And so I'm really glad that you were able to bring that out. So appreciate that. So Cole, I don't know what we do next. I don't know if you're opening up the floor for questions or not, but General, thank you very much. Great book. Great to have a chance to talk with you, and I appreciate all that you've done.
President Crow, thank you. What a privilege it is to be with you, and thank you so much.
So Cole, are we opening up to questions, or you want me to keep going? I've got all this to go off of.
Dr. Crow, General McMaster, thank you again for joining us. So we do have some user-submitted questions. Dr. Crow, it's up to you. You can either keep going with questions that you have, or we can scroll through and look at some of the ones that are submitted from our audience.
Yeah, I mean, those are I'm looking at some of those right now. Let me just take a quick look. You've got people that are greeting you in Hawaiian, so that's very good. A lot of these questions, I think you should get all of these questions. Here's one I think you've already addressed a little bit. So here we're sitting here, and China's moving forward. Two global economies are emerging. They're intricately tied with each other, whether we like it or not. And there's all kinds of, it's like we're playing a hockey game with no rules. The Chinese are allowed to check the Americans, without any penalty. There's no penalty box, et cetera, et cetera. So if you had three things that you could do, and I'm drawing from the question here also, if you had three things that you could do relative to China, where would you start?
I think first I would start on China's forms of economic aggression and work together as we are, but I would step up this effort with Japan, the EU, and others to demand reciprocity. This reciprocity in connection with access to the Chinese market, if China's coming with access to our market, and then also reciprocity in connection with listing on our exchanges. I think in general we should treat China like any other country and demand those same kind of standards. Actually make them make good on the promise they made when they joined the WTO, which is to play by the rules. The second would be to strengthen the military partnerships across the Indo-Pacific to ensure that China is unable to use this combination of co-option and coercion to create servile relationships with countries and engage in the largest land grab in history if they succeed, for example, in the South China Sea. So there's a military dimension to it as well. But the third thing I would recommend is more introspective. Let's make ourselves better. Let's take advantage of our competitive advantages. In the chapter in Battlegrounds, I essentially argue that we should turn what the Chinese Communist Party views as weaknesses into our greatest strengths. And this would be freedom of expression and freedom of the press. It would be our free market instead of a state-driven economic system. It is our rule of law instead of the rule of a single party, and it's strengthening democratic processes in a meaningful way across the world. The way that Senator John McCain advocated for his entire career. I don't think that anybody is culturally predisposed to not wanting a say in how they're governed. For example, and that doesn't mean that we should go around trying to impose Jefferson democracy. But those who are willing to help themselves, who want to reform, I think we and the rest of the free world should support those efforts.
So speaking of Senator McCain, Ambassador Mark Green's the new director of the McCain Institute, and he's asked, what are you most proud of from your days at the NSA?
Well, I'm most proud of the shift in the approach to China. I think that overall, we did put this process in place that you really summarized, Michael, to frame problems first, to understand them on their own terms, view them from the lens of our vital interests, but really to make implicit assumptions that often underpin our policies and strategies explicit and challenge them. That's what we did with China, and I think we implemented what is a bipartisan, I hope it will be a bipartisan, nonpartisan shift from this cooperation and engagement to the recognition that we have to compete and we have to re-enter some critical arenas of competition from which we've been absent.
So one of the questions I'm going to sort of modify a little bit, so that was sent in. So as you suggested, President Bush focused on the risks of pandemics. This is the third corona in 20 years. The first two were less contagious, more deadly. This one is less deadly, very contagious, but nonetheless very impactful. We had the Ebola incidents, and the military of the United States was heavily involved, and ASU was involved even in the Ebola experiences. Yet for the reasons that you suggest, we sort of weren't ready. This is not the last pandemic. This is there'll be a pandemic now within every 5 to 10 year cycle is probable. Because of the bio complexity of the planet, so we can't go through this again. And so, how do we ensure that when we learn something, it sticks, and whoever happens to be elected president of the United States, and I'm not commenting about the present president, I'm talking about the office, just can't say, well, never mind, I don't believe in any of this.
Right.
I mean, how do you do that?
Well, I think first of all, you have to actually study this most recent experience, the shortcomings in our response, and really learn from them. I've been so disappointed in how partisan this issue has become, and so what I did, Michael, is I asked for volunteers from students at Stanford. And we've engaged in a study over several months now that we're going to roll out in about a week from now, which are lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and what we can do to get through this pandemic.
My niece might be one of those students.
She is actually, and she's doing a great job on this task force. And what the method we used, it was pretty simple. We just interviewed people across the public and private sector who had an essential role in responding to the pandemic, and asked them, hey, what went well, what went wrong, what do you recommend? And synthesized those perspectives into this report, and we wrung all of the partisan politics out of this. So I think that what we've done is we've validated what were in the plans, 3 key tasks, right? It's best to stop a pandemic before it starts at its origins. Okay, thank you, Chinese Communist Party. We couldn't do that on this one, but we need better global surveillance and a response to contain it. The second is you have to mobilize a biomedical response. I mentioned supply chains, other impediments where we couldn't mobilize as quickly as we could, but the number one reason we couldn't is ineffective coordination, integration, sharing of authoritative data between departments of the federal government, between levels of government, because we are in a federal system, and between public and private sectors, because we have this hybrid healthcare system. So that's number one headliner: coordination, integration, sharing of data. And then the third aspect is innovation, biomedical innovation for therapies and for vaccines. I think we're going to come out okay on that, Mike, because there's been investment across many years in that area. And you're seeing that now, and this is from the U.S. government, the Gates Foundation, others who have contributed.
In fact, here at ASU, we've received lots of funding the last few years from DITRA, from BARDA, and from DARPA. So we're building a point-of-care sampling device. You spit into it, a microfluidic device tells you whether or not you have coronavirus or not, COVID or not, and then it communicates with your cell phone, green light, move ahead immediately. And so, or nearly immediately. So we're working on things like that, all as a function of the kind of infrastructure of scientific investment that we've got. So Cole, how are we doing for time?
We're good. We have about 15 minutes left if you want to fill that time, however you want.
So here's a tough question. And I'm asking you this as a, former general officer, and the role of the military in politics and so forth. So one of the listeners has asked, so we have this election, and who's ever president says, well, I'm not leaving.
Yeah. Well, they don't get to say that, and they won't be able to say that, right? So what's brilliant? Okay, our founders were brilliant, right? I think they were brilliant. Now, they were flawed. Our republic has always been a work in progress, but at our founding, they all asked each other, hey, what's the worst thing that could happen? And many of them had lived through, or their parents or their grandparents had lived through, the bloody wars of the 17th century in England. And what George Washington's grandparents fled the English Civil War. And so he had very much in his mind the specter of a man on horseback, Oliver Cromwell, right, who would undo our democracy. They also had in mind the danger of factions. Read political parties now, and how partisan we've become, and then how that could lead to what they feared, violence and divisions in our society. So one way to make sure that our democracy could survive is to separate the powers. The executive branch has no say in a secession of government. It's only the Congress and the judiciary who has a say. And so, I'm not worried about this. And when people speculate about the role of the military, that's just damaging in and of itself. All of us have a responsibility to keep that bold line in place between the military and our government, right? Nobody elects generals. They're not accountable to the people in our system. So it's very important to maintain civil control of the military, but also it's important for politicians on both sides not to try to drag the military into partisan politics. What bothers me these days too are these dueling lists of admirals and generals. Yes. I've got these guys signed up and gals signed up for me. My list is longer. I mean, I think that, I respect the right of those retired flag officers to sign up or do whatever they want, say whatever they want. But I think they just have to recognize that could come with a cost, right? And serving in our military should be rewarding, challenging, fulfilling for you, no matter what political party you're from. Nobody cares. And you know what? When you're fighting in combat, Michael, you're not looking at the man or woman next to you and saying, hey, what's the color of their skin? What's their religion? What's their political party? You're all in it together. You respect each other. You're bound together by mutual trust and respect. And you become a family. You become a family where the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. And I think we have to remember that as Americans. You know, when we got attacked on September 11th, Al-Qaeda didn't attack Republicans or Democrats. You know, they attacked Americans. And I think we are becoming so divided from each other. It's incumbent on all of us who have the ability to convene people, you know, whether it's just in our family, it's in our community, it's at a university, you know, to come together and restore confidence in who we are as a people, what we can agree on, maybe, before we talk about what we disagree on.
Yeah. So Mahmoud Norzai is checking in from Afghanistan, and he's asking you your views about the peace accords with the Taliban. I'm not exactly, when I read about the peace accords with the Taliban, I'm like, you know, I remember reading in Churchill's diaries, his first engagement actually in combat was on the border of then India, now Pakistan and Afghanistan. And what he talked about in terms of the nature of the tribal warfare there and the other things going on in that part of the world. And so just very, very complex. And so the question is, do you think that the Taliban and their regional allies, including Pakistan, which you do write about significantly in the book, are sincere in their commitments and that they'll cut ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups? And then can we get, you know, broader, in a sense, positive evolution in the region? Do you think we're moving in the right direction?
Absolutely not. I think what we're doing is an utter disaster, and we and the Afghan people, sadly, may have to pay a much higher price as a result. We've created, this is the ultimate in strategic narcissism. We've created the enemy. We conjured the enemy we wanted in Afghanistan instead of the enemy that really exists. There is no bold line, and Mr. Norzai, I'm sure, knows this as well. He is a Durrani Pushtun from the south of the country, I would imagine. He understands really the evolution of the Taliban, the brutal rule that they inflicted on the Afghan people from 1996 to 2001. And the Afghan people don't want this. So we have partnered, you know, with this small minority of really, I think, actually, you know, odious people who have inflicted great harm on humanity by sponsoring Al-Qaeda, but being brutal themselves, right? These are people who don't acknowledge any degree of human rights, especially women's rights. So, I mean, the question is, like, what does power sharing with the Taliban look like? Is that mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school is bulldozed? So I think we made a tremendous mistake in really what appears to be partnering with the Taliban against the Afghan government. And you know what the Taliban negotiators are saying to the Afghan negotiators right now? They're saying, hey, we beat the world's greatest superpower. Who are you to negotiate with us? You have nothing to bring to the table. And they're trying to dictate terms for power sharing. And of course, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are completely intertwined. It's a demonstrable fact, right? And I could go on about it. It's in the book. All this is in the book. Yeah. But it's immensely frustrating to me, Michael. I think that this is the perfect example of strategic narcissism at work.
Yeah. So Sangmin Lee, who's a reporter for Radio Free Asia, has written in, and he has asked, do you think North Korea will show some sort of bling here in before the U.S. presidential election to influence the election? Bling being some kind of missile action, missile threat, missile test, additional threats, target threats, Japanese intimidation, whatever you want to call it. So
I think it's more likely after the election, because I think what Kim Jong-un wants is to get back to the failed cycle of previous efforts to denuclearize. And that cycle is a big provocation, nuclear test, long-range missile test. And then we clamor typically, hey, can we talk to you? Can we talk to you? And North Korea, you know, feigns indifference, but then extorts payoffs in the form of reduced sanctions, but maybe oftentimes direct payoffs to the regime just for the privilege of talking with them. Then there's a long, drawn out, often frustrating negotiation that results in a weak agreement that locks in the status quo as the new normal, doesn't really change anything, and then sets North Korea up to break that agreement and repeat that cycle. Okay, let's not do that, I think, is what we should resolve to do. But I think after the election, there will likely be a provocation. much like in 2016 to 2017 was a period of very high activity for the North Korean regime. I think it's an immensely important issue. It's not going away. A big question that we have to watch right now is the regime actually getting a little bit more fragile now? You know, you actually had Kim Jong-un apologize to South Korea, which is something unusual. He's been disappearing for weeks at a time. We think maybe COVID-19 has been the best mechanism to enforce UN Security Council sanctions. And also there's a new class emerging in Pyongyang, a class of, of sort of a emerging middle class who's benefited from this corrupt authoritarian system, who has more to lose, right, than they've had to in the past. But of course, this is the world's only hereditary communist dictatorship.
Yes.
And they've defied predictions of their collapse, for many decades.
It's a strange artifact of, a 70-year-old war. In fact, it's a World War II artifact unresolved. And so we haven't talked at all about Africa. Maybe we'll make this the last thing that we focus on. So I was in Africa last year, and one of the places I was in Ghana, was in Accra, and I was in upcountry in Kumasi and other parts of Ghana, working on different projects that we have going on there. And what I noticed, unbelievably, was everywhere I went, and I walked into very impoverished communities, no running water, no sewage treatment, but there were soccer fields and field hockey and all kinds of other sports, and every single kid I saw was wearing Chinese uniforms that had been bought by some local Chinese business. With Chinese Mandarin lettering on the African team. Now, this is an English-speaking African country with unbelievable investments down at the level of micro businesses, micro lending. And so in other parts of the world that I've been, and other parts of Africa, it's the same thing. And it's like, we're there. We're working at university to university level. We're doing projects, making things happen, and that's about it. I didn't see a lot of other American influences there. So when you think about Africa with 1 billion people and unbelievable economic potential and unbelievable complexity and security threats, my son's also been in Nigeria and also in the Congo, working on projects where American interests are being advanced. So what's your thought about Africa? And I think we've decided not to take the comprehensive approach that the Chinese have taken, which is economic, political, social, financial, cultural, all aspects. We're sort of other than that. And so what's your thinking about Africa? And we'll make this the final question.
Well, China's devoted a massive amount of resources into Africa. We have to think of Africa, I think, on its own terms, and respect the African people on their own terms. The continent with tremendous promise. I mean, with a youth population that, if given the opportunity, with education and with economic growth and opportunity, could be incredibly productive for the world. There are also great dangers there as well, and I think that China actually exacerbates those dangers, especially with the support for authoritarian regimes that stifle the freedom and the say of people on the continent. I think Zimbabwe is kind of the poster child for that, in connection with China exporting its model to an authoritarian regime, and to invest in Africa in large measure for extractive reasons, right? China needs to fuel its economy. It wants to dominate advanced manufacturing in the emerging data economy and global economy, and to do it, I think, in many cases, at the expense of others. The Nigerian parliament, you mentioned Nigeria, recently passed a resolution against Chinese influence there. And I think there's a big aspect of this, Michael, that has to do with the interconnected issues of energy, environment, climate change, health security, and water security. We have to look at these interconnected problems as interconnected, and we have to work with African leaders and with the African private sector to help the continent succeed. Because if we don't, I mean, all those problems don't respect borders, right? And so what we're seeing is China talks a good game, for example, on the environment, but they're building 50 to 70 coal-fired plants a year. An African example is in Kenya. They're building a coal-fired plant, which will be the biggest carbon emitter in Kenya, right next to a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And so I think we have to call out that activity, but we have to be part of the solution as well. We ought to be advocating for conversion to LNG as a bridge into renewables. We ought to be fostering the broad range of solutions that are required to address the food security and food and water supply chains and so forth. So there's a lot we could do. We are doing a lot in Africa, but it's a big continent. You get lost there. China's investments, as you identified anecdotally, are massive, and they are largely, I think, aimed at building these servile relationships. What some journalists on the continent are now calling kind of a new form of colonialism. So I think our position ought to be, let's not compete with China dollar for dollar. We're not going to do that anyway. Much of our investment the vast majority of our investments will be private sector investments. And I think take the approach that Mark Green took, Ambassador Mark Green. He'd be a great person to talk about this, by the way, in a subsequent session. His vision for reinventing the U.S. approach to aid has tremendous potential, and I think needs to be amplified and implemented across multiple administrations to have the effect that he envisioned when he was the director of USAID.
Well, HR, it's a great book. I don't know how well it's doing. I hope it's doing very well, and it's I think provocative in the sense that you've been infected by the Stanford design logic, and you're offering a number of design pathways. And so, thanks for the chance to talk a little bit about the book, and look forward to continuing our discussions on other things. And thanks for connecting up with the McCain Institute and helping us to have these kinds of discussions get out to as many people as possible. So. Thanks for being here. And Cole, I don't know what we need to do to sign off, but anything you'd like to say finally at the end here, HR?
Nothing except thank you. What a privilege it's been to be with you. Thanks for the great work that you do at Arizona State and with the McCain Institute as well. Thanks to you and Mark Green, my friend. Thanks.
Thank you. So Cole, up to you.
Dr. Crow, General McMaster, thank you for joining us, and everyone in our audience, thank you for joining us as well. Our next session of our book talk series will be on Tuesday, October 20th, with Mark Salter talking about his new book, The Luckiest Man, Life with John McCain, to be moderated by Senator Joe Lieberman. But thank you again very much for joining us with this.
All right. Thanks a lot, Cole.
You, Cole. Take care.
Yeah, thank you, HR.
Thanks, man.